Alright guys, so for the next video in the drawing course, we are going to go over a technique called sighting, and that is where we are going to start to visually measure using just our arm, a pencil, sometimes a ruler, to measure the objects and get our proportions proper. So a major deal in any kind of drawing or visual arts class is getting your proportions correct, whether it's objects, landscape, human figure, getting proper proportions and setting up the proper measurements to then execute your drawing is incredibly important. And so we're just going to start with a basic object, this bottle here, and I'm going to go over the basic activity of sighting it. So what you'll want to do is have a relatively light lead. I'm using a HB. I don't know if you can quite see that, but it's the HB lead. You can also use a mechanical pencil. These are great because they have a nice thin lead on them. But basically, we're going to use our pencil to measure the object. So how do we do that? So with your arm fully extended, use my right arm, you then start with measuring the bottom of the bottle. Notice how I'm using the tip of the pencil, and even though my hand's shaking, I am measuring the bottom of the bottle. And then with that measurement, don't move your thumb, you then measure the height. So you measure the width first, then you measure the height. So 1, 2, just about 2.5. Now remember, we measured the width first using our arm fully extended. Don't bend your elbow. You measure the width first, and then measure the height, and that gives you a pretty good idea. So we said that was about 2.5 high to 1 wide. So for this bottle, we're going to say 1 to 2.5. So if I take a ruler, you don't have to use one, but I'm going to use one, and I measure, say it's about 2 inches I'm using for my measurement at the bottom. That means this bottle, do our measurements, would be about 5 inches tall. So that's our basic rectangle of measurement for 2 inches on the bottom, and it's approximately 5 inches high. Now we still have to proportion and sight the top of the bottle. So let's measure that top cap there. So we can even go back down to the width. And that looks like it's just about a half. So you can even mark a center line as well. If you'd like to measure a center line to get a nice vertical in there, you can. And I want to see all of your measurements as well. And then let's measure how high the cap is. So let's measure that. Let's measure that width again. So I'm always measuring the width. And when I go up, it's about the same. It's almost half, maybe just under. But now we have to look at, it's not, I have rectangles, so simple shapes. I have rectangles and squares drawn. We have to make those ellipses. So we look at the bottom of our bottle here. It does not have a flat line across the bottom here. You see that it does have that slight curve. And that's where, visually speaking, you need to really look hard and try to see the three-dimensional form of the object. And it's just a matter of rounding. You see where the bottom of this comes out. And essentially, you can even, like in our gestural drawing, you can draw through your object to help you get an ellipse. If you look at it, you can almost see the ellipse here. And as it comes up, you see that the bottom of our cap is also rounded. But then when we look at that plastic bottle, it's also an ellipse right at the base of that cap. So you see how it does curve down and around. So you can lightly and you can even measure, you can even take your pencil and measure how high. So if you take the width again, it's about 2. So you can even do a quick measure. And don't feel free to adjust. These are just measurements to help you. Because I noticed that the cap is just a little bit wider than I initially thought. To your measurements, it's all visually done. So if you have to adjust, feel free. Try not to erase as much. I want to see exactly how your eyesight is going. So notice how when I drew the cap, see how I initially drew it and then I drew it slightly larger to get the proportions proper. Notice on the left side I made some marks for my measurements, and I did that central line there, just kind of give me a good vertical. But notice I have these little marks on my object, and it really is those ellipses at the top and the bottom. That's where most of the work is going to come in. Because you will have to adjust. Because remember, see, it overlaps the cap just a little bit. And it comes around. And you can, if you want to use your shoulder, and really work on the ellipse and how these meet each other, you can for sure. So the more you want to sight your object, the more you can. If you want to make smaller adjustments, like if you want to measure, you know, how high this comes up on the cap, you can even measure that with your eye. It just depends on how invested you want to get into the sighting. So you can even measure your cap, and then I mean that ellipse probably comes like a tenth of the cap, 20th of a cap up there. But you can measure. You can even measure. You know, what's the angle like from the bottommost corner to the topmost corner? That as well. But the key for this exercise is to use your hand to sight the width and height of the different facets of the object. You know, how far down does that first ellipse come down from the cap? You know, you can sight and be able to sight and then use that to measure the widths and heights of each of your objects. And so your drawing should be relatively simple, and I want to see the measurements that you do. Try to keep your measurements and your hatch marks on the widths relatively light, and then as you feel more confident with your contours, you can darken those in to make them more substantial. So that's just a very basic sighting method that's been used since before the Renaissance. So have a crack at it, and let's see what you guys do.